Okay, we are back in Colossians. Does it seem like it's been a little while? We're in Colossians chapter 4. Has been, well, probably 2 Wednesdays in between, so that make it 3 weeks? Something like that. But Anil's shaking his head. I trust his math. So Colossians 4, now we haven't given you, we've come to the end of the memory verses, so I didn't give you any more, but we did encourage you if you wanted to work on some that you haven't done to do that. So as I said probably before, I'm not holding my breath, but if anybody did and would like to quote one tonight, we'll give you, or more, we'll give you the opportunity. So this is your chance. Is this on? Like I said, I'm not holding my breath. Good thing. All right. So next time, I'm probably not even going to ask. So what I want you to do, if you are ready, just say, ooh, Pastor, I got one. Oh, you're so excited from that last song. I guess not. Thank you. Brother Joe is. Help me, Brother Joe. Colossians chapter 4. All right, we'll see if we can get some Bible in you and get you going. How about that? Let's pray. Father, it's good to be saved. It's good to be here tonight on Wednesday night. I thank you for salvation. I thank you for, Lord, the scriptures. As we get into them tonight, I pray for open eyes, open ears. I pray you'd strengthen us, Lord, by your might in the inner man, that we might go away from this place tonight stronger, more equipped to serve you, Lord, ready to give an answer to every man that asketh us of the reason of the hope that's in us with meekness and fear, and give us opportunities, Lord, to do just that. I pray, Lord, for you to have your hand upon things tonight from start to finish, and give us, Lord, give us what we need to be more like thee and more pleasing in your sight. I ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, Colossians chapter 4. Now we are going to get ready to start in verse number 9, but I'm back up to the beginning of the sentence, which was verse number 7, and we'll get our bearings there and just briefly highlight a thing or two, and then we'll get on into verse number 9. So verse 7, all my state, says the Apostle Paul, all my state shall Tychicus declare unto you, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. And we talked about Tychicus, and he says of this faithful minister and fellow servant, in verse 8, whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate and comfort your hearts. So he sent him, he says, for the same purpose. And the same purpose being that he might know your estate. Now, why does he say the same purpose? Because Paul said that's what Tychicus was going to do about Paul to them. Verse 7, all my state shall Tychicus declare unto you. And I'm sending him, he's going to do that. And I sent him also for the same purpose, that he might know your estate. So he's going to tell you how I'm doing, but he also wants to know how you're doing. We're going to find out both. We're going to communicate those things. He'll let you know how I'm doing. You let him know how you're doing, and probably somehow Tychicus get word back to Paul how the Colossians are doing. And that's why he said he sent them, that he might be able to know those things. And then in verse number, that's I guess all we need to cover in that. So let's go on to verse number 9, where we're going to start with some additional material. Verse number 9, the sentence continues. He says, with Onesimus. So he sends Tychicus along with Onesimus. Both of them are being sent by Paul to the Colossians. And he says of Onesimus, with Onesimus, a faithful brother who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. So he's going to, as he said at the beginning of verse number 7, Tychicus is going to let him know his state, but he's going to do it along with Onesimus. Tychicus and Onesimus together are going to let him know how everything is going and all the things that were done there. Not only Paul's state, but the state of the ministry and the things that are happening there where Paul is. And of course, Paul is writing this from a Roman prison, as we understand him being a prisoner and this epistle being written from Rome. Now, Onesimus, you might recognize Onesimus from another epistle, and that would be, anybody? Philemon. That's it. So let's go to look at Onesimus and Philemon. I know at least a couple of you all had that dialed in. Philemon, little epistle, one chapter right before the book of Hebrews. And he is a main character in the book of Philemon. Paul, in the epistle to Philemon, is, of course, writing to Philemon, and he's writing to him in particular about this man named Onesimus. So look in Philemon and go on down to verse number 10 there in Philemon. Paul writes to Philemon saying, I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds. Now, Paul speaks in the spiritual sense here. He begat Onesimus in his spiritual bonds in prison in the gospel. Onesimus got saved. And now Paul looks at him as a spiritual son, refers to him that way. I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds, which in time past was to thee unprofitable, but now profitable to thee and to me. So what we understand of Onesimus is that he was a servant for Philemon, had gone away, gone astray, and was unprofitable to him. And now Paul's going to send him back, and he's beseeching Philemon to basically have mercy on him and receive him as a brother. He's now saved, and before in the past he wasn't profitable to you, and now he's profitable both to you and also, says Paul, to me. And Paul means in that regard in the ministry, as this guy has taken root and he's doing well and ready to go, and he gets a chance now to head on back. And we'll see more about that in a little bit. So right now, hold Philemon, if you would, and we're going to go back to the book of Colossians. All right, Colossians and chapter number 4 and verse number 9. Let's pick up something else about Onesimus. He says, with Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, we saw how that he was saved also, not only here, but in Philemon. Paul had begotten him in his bonds. And now he's said to be a beloved brother, said to be a faithful brother. So more than just saved, he's again taken root and he's growing, and he's established and borne some fruit. And then he says this, which I read a moment ago, who is one of you. So Onesimus is from Colossae. He is a Colossian. He's one of you. And that's who Paul's writing to. And Paul is going to send him back, as we said, to the Colossians. But some other things begin to emerge as well. Go back now to Philemon, because, as I said before, we'll now see that Paul's not only sending him to the Colossians, but he's sending him to Philemon, which would indicate Philemon himself is a Colossian, because that's where he's headed. Philemon, verse number 12, Paul talking to Philemon of Onesimus says, whom I have sent again, thou therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels. He's sending him back to Philemon. Now, if you check Ussher's chronology, which is in the margin, center column reference margin of the Schofield Bible, for example, Schofield Reference Bible, both Colossians and Philemon are said to have been written in AD 64. So these things are taking place about the same time. And while he writes to the Colossians, he's also writing specifically to Philemon. And there's a common thing that we're reading in both of them is Onesimus is going back. And Paul is telling the Colossians that he's sending Onesimus back, and he's telling Philemon that he is sending him back. So this, to me, appears to be the same incident, just being told to two different people about Onesimus being returned. So we'll continue on here in Philemon while we're here in verse number 12. Whom I have sent again, thou therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels, whom I would have retained with me, that in thy stead he might have ministered unto me in the bonds of the gospel. I'd like to have kept him because he's been such a blessing and a help to me. But verse 14, without thy mind would I do nothing, that thy benefit should not be as it were of necessity, but willingly. I'm not just going to impose myself. I want you to make that choice yourself, because it really is your choice to make, is what he's getting at. For perhaps he therefore departed for a season, that thou shouldest receive him forever. Right? He left you before, and things weren't well, but maybe he did that in what was not a good situation, so that he could wind up getting saved, and you could now dwell with him in eternity forever, since you're a brother in Christ as well. Thou shouldest receive him forever, literally. not now as a servant, which, of course, we infer now from these words that he was a servant to Philemon, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, especially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord. If thou count me therefore as a partner, receive him as myself. If he have wronged thee or oweth thee aught, put that on mine account. I, Paul, have written it with mine own hand, I will repay it. And so Paul's going on about this thing with Onesimus being returned and being in the Lord now, being a brother in the Lord, and being in good spiritual shape. And that's what we seem to be getting into again in Colossians chapter 4. And so back to Colossians 4 in verse number 9 with Onesimus there. Colossians 4, verse number 9. With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. Again, that would be Tychicus and Onesimus. Tychicus, verse number 7, at the beginning of the sentence. Onesimus here as we get to the end of the sentence. Both of them are going to make known to the Colossians all the things which are done here. Here being, again, where? Rome, where Paul is in prison. And now, to verse number 10, another guy shows up, a couple of them, and we first see Aristarchus. And he says in verse 10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. So now shows up this one Aristarchus. Aristarchus also shows up in Philemon. I'll just let you know that would be toward the end there in verse number 24, where he's just mentioned in a list of Paul's fellow laborers. But in addition to that, you see him first in the Bible in the book of Acts. And in Acts, we learn some things about Aristarchus. We learn, first of all, he is a Macedonian. He's of Macedonia. Real quick, let's take a peek and see where we see that in Acts chapter 19. Acts 19, verse 29. Acts 19, 29. And the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. So we understand him to be, first of all, Macedonian. Secondly, one of Paul's travel companions. So he is there with Paul in Rome while he is imprisoned as well, and said to be his fellow prisoner. So he got imprisoned as well for the work of the gospel. Now, additionally, in Acts, go to chapter number 27, where it says it again, specifically, Acts 27:2. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian, being with us. But there he's said to be a Macedonian, but it gives us something else, which I omitted when I read it there, a Macedonian of Thessalonica being with us. So Thessalonica is within Macedonia. And go back now to chapter 20. We were in 19 before, but go to chapter 20. And there we find him also acknowledged to be a Thessalonian. So he is a Macedonian, but he is a Thessalonian, kind of like, you are an American, but also a New Yorker, right? So he is specifically a Thessalonian in Macedonia, also referred to in larger respect as a Macedonian. Acts 20, verse 4, and there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and he goes on with some others. But there's Aristarchus said to be a Thessalonian. So again, we learn some things about these folks as they're mentioned. Sometimes not a whole lot is mentioned about them, but you can gather some things about them from the little that is mentioned. And what's a blessing above all things for them is that they're mentioned. We talk about like Onesimus and then Aristarchus here. They're mentioned in the Bible in a good light, and that's a blessing. And I've said before, and I might have been in this study recently, but somewhere, not everybody that's mentioned in the Bible is mentioned in a good light. So if you're going to get in the Bible, this is the best way to get in it. All right, a little bit more now, back to Colossians chapter 4. A little bit more yet in this verse. That'll be it with Aristarchus. But he says, Aristarchus, verse number 10, Colossians 4, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom you received commandments. If he come unto you, receive him. All right, Marcus. Interesting reference to Marcus. Sometimes in the Bible, people are known by different names or variations of a name. This Marcus we know of by, we see him. Sometimes we refer to him with three names, but we see him with three different names in the scriptures. One's closely related to Marcus, and that is Mark. He's also referred to as John, and said that his surname is Mark. So sometimes he's referred to as John Mark. But John Mark, he's John, he's Mark, he's Marcus. And this is the same one. This is one that has a relationship with Barnabas. And we see him showing up in the book of Acts, and that's where I'd like to take you to Acts chapter 15. And here's a very prominent or important story, kind of a watershed type moment in the book of Acts, where to this point, the missionary work and Paul's missionary companion had been done by Paul and Barnabas. And now it's about to have a drastic shift. And it's not going to be Paul and Barnabas after Acts 15. Because remember in Acts 16, Paul goes to prison, right? He's in the Philippian jail. And who is it there? Paul and who? Paul and Silas. So from 15, Paul and Barnabas, but then after that, we're going to Paul and Silas. And Silas is going to show up here at the end of 15. We'll see how that comes about. Acts chapter 15, verse 26. And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they do. So he wants to do some follow-up. We've been here, we've ministered. Let's go back and check on these folks. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. And there he is. John or John Mark or Marcus. And by the way, it's not unusual for somebody that's named like Marcus to be called Mark. I think of our brother Marco, who's now home with the Lord. But sometimes his relatives would talk to me about him. They just call him Mark. We always look at him and call him Marco. So I'm just shortening it to Mark. But here's Barnabas in verse 37 and John Mark. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him. That is Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia and went not with them to the work. So this guy apparently left for some reason. I don't know, maybe he was homesick. He left. I don't think we ought to take him this time, He got to be a baby, went home, he left us. I don't want to be in that situation again. And they got to fighting and arguing about this. And it says in verse number 39, and the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. Paul and Barnabas now have a split. What often happens in church splits is, strange thing, I guess in Romans 8:28 fashion, you wind up with two ministries. There's churches that have multiplied, not the good way, but I don't know, what do you call that? Is it fission? Am I thinking of the right word? Kind of a division. They kind of divide, and then you got two. So that's what happens. And Barnabas takes Mark, and Paul takes Silas. So again, verse 39, the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder, one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed into Cyprus. They're going to do ministry work there. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren under the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So they go to Cyprus, and Paul goes, and Silas go to Syria and Cilicia. So you got now two works going. That's not the ideal way for works to reproduce themselves, but sometimes it happens. And this is what happened. Now, it's a very interesting story and insightful even there. But when we get to Colossians, we get even more insight about it, because let's go back there and pick up something that we read. And that is this, Colossians chapter 4, verse number 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, notice, sister's son to Barnabas. So Marcus is Barnabas' sister's son. Now, I'm kind of pleased with myself because I got this one. These relationships can be confusing. But what would that be? You help me out. Nephew? Are we agreed? Nephew. So if you have, just think if you have a sister, your sister has a child, then that's your nephew. And they call you aunt or uncle, depending on what you are. So that's the relationship. So Marcus is Barnabas' nephew, and there's a little blood relationship there. And Barnabas is standing up for his nephew, wants Paul to give him another chance. Paul would have none of it, and it's not unusual for these church rows or splits to have family involved. It has happened. It happened here in Acts, and it's happened time and time again down through the years. And we're not saying who's right or who's wrong. There's probably error on both parts. I mean, you like to think that Paul, who was always talking about grace, would have had a little bit more with Barnabas, but there's usually more to the things than meets the eye. And so anyway, that's a little bit more insight about what is going on there. And again, I find it very insightful. So back to Colossians 4. And we know that Paul, because there's more here too. Paul's not happy with him, is he? And the issue, Paul would have taken Barnabas, but Barnabas standing up for Mark, and Paul probably still would have taken Barnabas. But Barnabas said, "Nah, I'm going to go. You don't want him. I'm going to go with Mark." So again, you could maybe fault Barnabas and thing, whatever. You could also commend him for standing up for his nephew. A lot of different angles you could look at this thing. Bottom line is, Paul had an issue with Mark. But now when we get to Colossians chapter 4, it says, and this is Paul speaking, "Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom ye receive commandments, if he come unto you, receive him." Paul is now standing up for Marcus. Time has passed. The date in Colossians, as I mentioned before, is 64 AD. Acts chapter 15 is 52 AD. 12 years later, Paul and Marcus are in good standing again. And good for Paul. Good for Paul. Good for Paul not to hold it against him. Good for Paul to allow restoration. And by the time he gets to the end of his ministry, Paul is standing up strongly for this man. Now, as I said, this is 64 AD, but I'll show you an indication. Go to 1 Peter chapter 5, that the reconciliation took place even years before, some years before that. 1 Peter 5. The church together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus, my son. Marcus salutes him there. Paul's in good with Marcus there. By the way, look at verse 12. "By Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose I have written, briefly exhorting and testifying that this is a true grace of God wearing," and then he references Marcus. And he's got Barnabas there. He's got not Barnabas, but he's got, and as